So my name is Casey Trupin. I'm with the ABA. You all know what the American Bar Association is. The ABA's Commission on Homelessness and Poverty. I'm a special advisor to the commission, and I'm very thrilled to be moderating this session today. We have three pretty incredible panelists. And so first, just quickly some house cleaning for those who just walked in. Make sure you sign up for your CLE materials, your CLE credit, and don't leave the room without filling out an evaluation, which is up here in blue. For those of you who are not familiar with the commission is a group of ABA members appointed by the president of the ABA, and our charge is to educate members of the bar about issues related to homelessness and poverty, to help advance pro bono efforts related to homelessness and poverty, and of course help in setting policy for the ABA related to homelessness and poverty. And this is a topic on which we are certainly focusing, and so the CLE is well timed, and we're thrilled to have all of you here today. Again, I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the books that we put together. Lawyers Working to End Homelessness, which is now a couple of years old, but it talks about lawyers working in a variety of capacities on efforts to end homelessness among youth, among families, veterans, single individuals. Educating Children Without Housing, 3rd edition, which is a great kind of overview of the federal laws related to the education of homeless children, who number now more than 1 million throughout the U.S., and as well how to implement those laws in a way that really leads to fundamental changes and better education for children. And Runaway and Homeless Youth and the Law, Model State Statutes, which is this is how the experts, 170 experts in the country, think the laws should be as they pertain to runaway and homeless youth. And it's a great also companion piece to a piece put out by the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty called Alone Without a Home, which details how the laws currently are. But as lawyers, we can ignore what the laws say, right? And just write and advocate for what they should be. Yeah. So on that note, today's session, we're going to try and make it as interactive as possible. We're limiting our panelists, who could certainly talk for hours about what they're doing, to just relatively short presentations, and then we're going to engage in discussion for the remainder of the 4 hours that we have. We will do. I'm totally joking. See if anybody would pick up on that. See how lively of an audience we have. We may end early. We'll see, unless there are people who are raising their hands asking for homework. We'll start off with the presentations, and then I will try at my best to moderate a lively discussion. You should not be shy about asking questions or providing feedback or pontificating, or as long as it's relatively on topic, we'll let it go. So let me just quickly introduce our three panelists. To my immediate right is Maria Foscarenas, who is the founder and executive director of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. I think if you have worked in the field of legal issues related to people who are homeless, you know Maria's name. She's been working on these issues since 1985, helped put together the Stuart B. McKinney Homeless Assistance Act. She was just an attorney in a law firm, right, who took on a pro bono case and got sucked in, and in 1985 she left that firm and went on to establish a national office, or a DC office, for the National Coalition for the Homeless, and then founded the Law Center in 1989, where she's directed it ever since. She's done significant litigation, significant legislative advocacy on these issues as well, and speaks widely. So we're thrilled to have Maria here. She's also a former member of the commission. Did I miss anything? I mean, I missed plenty, but we'll get to the other stuff. Karen Stevens, to Maria's right, is the senior counsel and director of the International and U.S. Attorneys Civil Enforcement Programs of the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. She is no newcomer to these issues either. I can't mention everything that she does, but a very impressive resume. She coordinates the department's participation in the Equality Working Group, which is an interagency mechanism to enhance the U.S. government's domestic implementation of its international treaty obligations. And Karen has represented the U.S. before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights at the Organization of American States. She's a former clerk for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, Honorable David Tatel, I blew it on that one, and a proud Detroit native and a graduate of University of Michigan. 2 times over. Heidi Wegleitner, to Karen's right, is a staff attorney at Legal Action of Wisconsin. She is the staff attorney that a lot of us dream to be because she has dual roles. She's a legal services attorney who practices housing law and does eviction defense and subsidized housing issues. But she also was recently elected to the Dane County Board of Supervisors to represent a district in the city of Madison with over 13,000 residents. So she gets to make the law, and I just have this vision of Heidi sitting there and looking at proposals coming across her desk and thinking about when she's going to file her first lawsuit on her colleague's proposal. So that just seems so cool to me. Heidi has been working for 3 years on working with community groups and the city of Madison and the county as well to pass and implement resolutions which recognize housing as a human right. So she brings a very useful perspective to this panel. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Maria and then Karen and then Heidi and let them talk a little bit about what they're doing. And they won't spoil it all for you, and we'll save some good stuff. You can tell me when to advance the slides.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Casey. And before I get started, I just want to clarify that when I got started in this work, I was about 10 years old. So
we all were, right?
Yeah, we all were, but I really was. So, any case, so I'm going to talk about the human right to housing and give a kind of an overview. But first, I'm going to tell you about the Law Center. The National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty is an organization. Could you advance it, please? That is we're based in Washington, and our mission is to end and prevent homelessness in the United States, and we do that through legal strategies. Our belief is that in order to end and prevent homelessness, we need to get recognized in this country the human right to housing, housing as a basic human right that everybody needs and everybody should have. Next slide, please. So that's an old picture. Oh, no. Did we go one over? Do we have different slides? All right. I guess we have different slides. Okay. So over the past decade, okay. So that's an old picture. Took a while to come up. In any case, but
that was when you were 10.
Yeah, right, exactly. So that's a picture of some of our staff, what I wanted to say is that over the past decade plus, we have been moving our vision of the human right to housing forward by hosting a range of different training events, national forums, regional and local forums, webinars, and publishing reports and creating lots of materials on the human right to housing. And the idea is to provide as many practical tools we can so that people can actually, around the country, can actually work on establishing a human right to housing. So I'll start with, I want to share a little bit of what we have to offer. There's lots more materials on our website, so if you're interested, I encourage you to look there. But I'll just give a little overview here, and I'll start with a brief background of the human right to housing, and then I'll give you some examples of how advocates here in the U.S. are actually relying and using human rights frameworks to have concrete impact in their communities. And finally, I'll give you some comparative examples from other parts of the world that have made progress on the human right to housing. Okay, so starting with the human right to housing, what is it? Well, it has some very clearly American origins. This is not a foreign concept really to us. In fact, when FDR gave his State of the Union address in 1944, he called for a second Bill of Rights to supplement the first Bill of Rights. First Bill of Rights mainly is civil and political rights. In the second Bill of Rights, he included the idea of the right of every family to a decent home. You may remember the 4 freedoms, freedom from want. That's what this fits into. So the idea that there are some basic economic and social rights as well. So at the international level, a few years later, when the UN was created, one of the foundational documents of that body is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that includes, in Article 25.1, a statement about the right to an adequate standard of living for everybody. And that includes, among other things, the right to housing, or adequate housing. Whether or not the declaration is legally binding is controversial. Experts disagree on this. It's a declaration, it's not a treaty, however, it's widely accepted, so maybe it's common international law. But regardless of that, after the declaration, a treaty called the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights was created. And this explicitly recognizes and elaborates on the right to housing as well as other economic and social rights. This is a treaty that the U.S. has signed. President Carter signed it, but it has not been ratified by the Senate. So it has a kind of intermediate status. We're not actually bound to it, but at the same time, we're supposed to not act in contradiction to it. We're supposed to not be working against the purpose of the treaty. So what is the human right to housing? So I'm going to talk about this treaty, and there is a committee on economic, social, and cultural rights that oversees the covenant and interprets it. It's sort of like, it issues guidance. So it's kind of like a federal or an agency, a regulatory agency issuing guidance on the law. And so the relevant guidance here is called General Comment 4, which says that the human right to housing consists of 4 elements. And they're laid out on the PowerPoint. You'll see it's more than just 4 walls and a roof over your head. For one thing, it's adequate housing. And it also includes the neighborhood to outside your home, access to services, and so forth. And it's also the creation of a legal framework that protects and recognizes that right. And under human rights law, countries are required to take progressive steps to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to the maximum of the country's available resources. So there's built into this a little bit of relativity in the sense that it matters what a country's resources are. The obligation might look different in an underdeveloped or developing country than it looks in a developed country like the United States. And also it requires non-discrimination in housing. It does not mean, though, that the government is required to build a free house to give it to everybody. What it does require is that the government ensure that there are policies in place that result in everybody having affordable housing. And that can be accomplished in any number of ways. It could be through public-private partnerships, it could be tax incentives, it could be direct government expenditures, or some combination of all of those. But it requires affirmative steps to make sure that everybody is able to afford, has a place that they can live in and can afford. So, moving on to how are advocates actually using human rights strategies here in the United States. What does this mean? Why can it be useful? How can it be useful? So we're going to hear from Heidi about her work in Madison, Wisconsin, to get a resolution recognizing the human right to housing. But I can also tell you that advocates in a number of places have worked on resolutions like that. For example, in Chicago, in LA, in Eugene, Oregon, they have used strategies to get local local and even state level governments to adopt or recognize in some way the human right to housing. We at the Law Center had worked on a resolution on the right to housing in Congress, which has not yet become law, and which we're working on reintroducing in the new Congress. In addition, we have also, in addition to these human rights specific resolutions, we've also worked with partners around the country on substantive legislation that is based in human rights. So for example, this past year, our friends and colleagues in Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless, got the first ever Homeless Bill of Rights enacted by their state. And similar efforts are underway in California and Oregon and Delaware. We've also used international venues and mechanisms to promote the human right to housing here in the U.S. And we do that in several ways. So one way is through these international processes, we can shine a light on what is happening here in the U.S. So we can argue that the U.S. is falling short as far as international obligations or standards go in fulfilling the right to housing or fulfilling other human rights. And so, for example, we worked with the legal services of Northern California and other advocates in Sacramento to use the visit of the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to water and sanitation to raise their concerns about the lack of access to public restrooms and drinking fountains for people who were living on the street or in encampments because they had no other place to go. So Special Rapporteur is just is a UN expert on a particular human right. In this case, it was a human right to water and sanitation. She visited, she was shocked by what she saw there. The local advocates got to meet with her. She actually wrote a report about this as part of her visit, an official UN report, and even wrote a letter to the mayor, which is rather, actually highly unusual, but she wrote a letter to the mayor. This generated a lot of attention, a lot of media, and a kind of reframing of the issues there as human rights issues, and also contributed to the enactment of state legislation calling for recognition of the human right to water, and saying that when agencies, state agencies make changes, they must take into account the impact on the human right to water. So that was an actual concrete victory there, which I think is significant. The rapporteur also issued the report, as I mentioned, and we worked with her to make sure that she addressed the issue of criminalization of homelessness more generally, and analyzed it in human rights context as a violation of human rights. So our strategies are having impact, and one of these impacts is that last June, the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, which is an independent federal agency that's the point agency on homelessness, on the federal government's response to homelessness, they issued a joint report on criminalization. It's called Searching Out Solutions, which says that criminalizing homelessness, in other words, passing laws that make it a crime to sleep in public, for example, even though there's no other alternative, that may violate not just constitutional and U.S. constitutional rights, but also human rights under the Covenant Against Torture and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, both of which the U.S. has signed and ratified. So this is the first time to our knowledge, that a federal agencies have taken this kind of position. We think it's very significant, and we are working to disseminate it and use it in communities across the country. So finally, to finish up, some international examples Some examples from countries where the right to housing has been more generally accepted and adopted and is being implemented so that we can play out what does this actually mean? How can it play out in practice? Scotland is a very good example of the difference that a rights-based approach can make. So Scotland passed the Homeless Act of 2003 with a goal of creating over 10 years a right to housing for all homeless people. And it includes the right of all homeless persons to be immediately housed and the right to long-term supportive housing for as long as it's needed. It also includes a private right of action and requires jurisdictions to plan for development of an adequate supply of affordable housing. Complementary policies include the right to purchase public housing units and automatic referrals by banks to foreclosure prevention programs to help people remain in their homes. So implementation has not been 100% wonderful. I mean, there have been issues that have come up in implementation, but advocates there seem to believe that the act is overall working well and making genuine and concrete progress in significantly reducing homelessness in Scotland. So I think this is a good model that we can learn from. South Africa is, I'll touch on as well. South Africa has a right to housing in its constitution, and it's explicitly informed by international human rights standards. And there is now developing jurisprudence there and cases that have developed the right of squatters to have adequate housing provided to them if they are evicted from the public place where they're squatting, even though they have no right to the properties that they're squatting in. And they are allowed to remain until alternative accommodation is available. This is not equivalent, of course, to full right to housing because squatting can't really be considered adequate housing, but it's a step along the way. And with that, I think I will end my presentation. Again, we've got lots of materials on our website, so take a look there. And we have other panelists.
Thanks, Brenda. So we're going to turn it over to Karen Stevens to talk a little bit about the federal government's perspective on this and the role that they've played and continue to play. So, Karen.
Well, I want to thank Casey and Maria's colleague Eric Tars for inviting me here. I have been at the Department of Justice almost since I finished law school and joined the Civil Rights Division in 1999. But it was really not until 2009 that I became significantly involved in this sort of human rights implementation and reporting. And so what I thought I would talk about today is a little bit about how things have evolved for the Civil Rights Division in the department and the rest of the federal government since 2009, a little bit about the context where we started and sort of where we are today. I think we've made a lot of progress, and we're also, I think, maybe like some of the lawyers that you've mentioned, sort of thinking about the same questions. You know, how does this really implicate the work we're doing? How does it make a difference in what we're doing? How should it be making a difference? And what should we be concentrating on that will really make a difference in what we're all trying to do, whether it's civil rights or human rights? You know, ensure that people, you know, in this context have a home, have the right to a house, and are not being discriminated against in getting it. As I said, in 2009, after the election of President Obama and the transitions that were going on in the Department of Justice and elsewhere, one of the my immediate supervisor was a woman named Julie Fernandez, who some of you in DC may have known. Julie Fernandez had done a lot of work at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights for a few years before coming back to the Department of Justice, and that group has also spent a lot of time thinking again about how their longtime advocacy and role in promoting civil rights here in the United States, how does that fit into a human rights framework, and they've been moving to expand that. And so she came in with some very specific ideas about things she would like to see us do in the Civil Rights Division. And up until that point, we had been somewhat involved, but really more in the context of treaty reports. And I'll give a little bit of context to something that Maria referred to. The United States has signed and ratified 4 treaties which have, are considered human rights obligations, and one of the handouts which you'll receive has links on the State Department website where the State Department has posted the text of these treaties and the various reports both that the United States submits and the reports that come back from the committees that monitor these treaties at the United Nations. And so, again, the general scheme, and it's a little different, but just in general, again, once we sign and ratify a treaty, there are committees at the United Nations that are charged with monitoring compliance and activities under all of these treaties. And usually about every 4 years, each signatory to a treaty is required to submit a report to that UN committee explaining what they've done to implement their obligations. They're asked to consult with civil society or advocates about their views on compliance and gaps. And civil society also has the opportunities to submit reports to this committee. There's usually a presentation, often it's in Geneva, where the United States has to send a delegation to sort of come before the committee and answer some questions after the committee has reviewed the report. And then at some period after that, usually of several months, the committee will issue its own final report. For some of these conventions, it's often called concluding observations and recommendations, where they will identify specific things that they think the United States should be doing differently or should be taking action on. And then the cycle repeats. And so in that context, what had generally been happening in the United States, at least from my inside the government perspective, is that the State Department, who is in charge, of course, of our diplomacy and foreign affairs and represents the United States before the State Department, had the primary responsibility for treaty reporting. They would draft a report, they would send it out to the other agencies through a process where we would all get a chance to look at it and provide comments, and that was really when we engaged in the treaty process. About every 3 or 4 years, we would see a draft report. It would make various statements, sort of updating what had been said in the last report, and they would ask us to correct it or identify any big gaps. And we did that the same way we commented on, proposed regulations, draft legislation that was coming through the government. It was part of our general clearance. And so again, that gave us some input, and again, at the Civil Rights Division for the human rights treaties, because a lot of what those obligations are concerned with really deals with the work that we do every day more than any other part of the government. Again, we were relatively more involved than other agencies or even other parts of the Department of Justice. There was a focus very much on reporting in a very defined timeline. And there would usually be one consultation where the State Department would invite groups in prior to submitting the report to give them a chance to offer comments and suggestions. And sometimes we attended those consultations. So again, aside from sort of political appointees and this reporting, we didn't really have a lot of coordination either with the State Department or with our federal agency colleagues. And again, it was very focused on kind of a retrospective, what's happened in the last 4 years. Has anything happened on these recommendations that came down? What can we say? And so one of the things that many people who came into the administration and who had worked on human rights in groups and civil society on the outside for many years, both at the State Department and at Justice, and I think also because of a real concerted effort by groups in civil society, people like Maria and her colleagues who also really wanted to see this change, they came in with some real goals about how to expand and enrich this process and make it more transparent, make it more accountable. And what this also coincided with was a new process at the United Nations that's called the Universal Periodic Review. And Maria talked about the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Every member of the United Nations, I think, either signs or accepts that declaration. I guess it must have been in around 2008, the UN started a new process. In addition to these various treaties and the committees that review these treaties, the UN itself decided that they would take all of the countries that belong to the UN, basically divide them into 4 groups, and each group of countries was going to be reviewed every 4 years on the whole range of its human rights obligations. And so the first, and the way that works, again, is that the country is asked to consult with civil society in their country to prepare a report that's actually only supposed to be 20 pages long and submit it. And then again, send a delegation to the UN where again, that report has been reviewed by, what do they call it, a troika. They appoint 3 representatives, one and from different countries, not your own country, to review the report and sort of conduct this review. And every country that belongs to, I guess, the Human Rights Council, or maybe even the United Nations, has an opportunity to review the report. There's a session at the UN Human Rights Council where the country's delegation sits in the front, the commissioners and the council are there, and every country in the United Nations has about 2 minutes to make recommendations to that country based on their review of the report and the issues they have seen, and the country has an opportunity to make some presentations and then respond. And then again, after that, the country is asked to formally accept or indicate which of these recommendations it accepts. And so this was a process, again, that had started at the UN. It must have been in about 2008, but the first review for the United States was scheduled for 2010. And so this kind of intersection of this desire inside the government and outside the government to have a richer, more coordinated, forward-looking process, and this universal periodic review combined, I think, to really, in a lot of ways, set a very strong foundation for a new view on human rights implementation and activity here in the, domestically, as they would say, human rights at home. As part of the Universal Periodic Review, the State Department, with support from the National Security staff at the White House, really kind of led what we thought, and I think it was in many ways, sort of an unprecedented sort of series of consultations. We hosted, or I shouldn't even say we hosted, we partnered with civil society on 11 consultations held all over the country. Some of them focused on whatever the issues might be in a geographic area. Some of them focused on specific substantive issues. And there's a link, again, on the bottom of the sheet. The State Department actually posted summaries of each of the consultations online as part of, there's a UPR page on the State Department website, which includes summaries of all those consultations. But we really, we at the Civil Rights Division and Justice, I think, had a lead on the agency side on about 5 of them. I worked on a consultation in Chicago, hosted at the John Marshall Law School, their clinic on fair housing and human rights, focused on housing rights. We were there for a day and a half. In that stage, the federal government really came and listened, but we were joined by colleagues from the Housing and Urban Development, HUD, the Department of Agriculture, both Washington representatives and local representatives of the regional office. And we really, and the John Marshall Law School in that case, hosted and identified other groups to really decide who was going to present, what the issues would be. They took us on a tour of, the former area of Chicago, where the large housing projects, Cabrini Green and others, had been demolished. We talked to residents there. We went to a neighborhood on the south side and looked at the impact of the foreclosure crisis on specific neighborhoods and heard from both advocates and community leaders. We took a walking tour. It was, like I said, the State Department joined us, which again for them was unprecedented. They're usually focused on what's happening in Uganda and other places, but they really also were very engaged with this process. And I think for the State Department, there were really 2 goals. The State Department and this president and former Secretary of State Clinton really saw our human rights implementation as both a way to re-engage internationally, because the United States had really stepped back from the Human Rights Council and human rights work in the 8 years before, and also to set a model that this was a new process at the UN, and we had certain things that we wanted to encourage other countries to do. Things that sometimes we take for granted, things sometimes that we could do better, things like listening to civil society, letting them criticize you and ask questions in public, and being responsible and accountable for that. engaging a wide range of sort of government officials at a high level and taking this process very seriously. And coming to the United Nations, again, was a very strong and broad delegation. They wanted to set a high bar for what they wanted to sort of model things that they hoped other countries would adopt and what they could ask other countries and the UN to expect. And so this really, again, led to, as you can imagine, it was kind of like a roadshow for those of us on the government side. You know, not only were we hearing about these things and working with it, we were traveling with each other and our colleagues to do these presentations. And I think we really engaged. We had a core, both staff level and a level of engagement at our political leadership in this process that really built some real relationships. And for a lot of us, it was our first exposure to this work and to what the State Department's work overseas and how it really related to what we did. And so again, this culminated in 2010 when about 25 of us, I think, from about 10 agencies. Again, I talked mostly about HUD. There was a consultation in New Orleans on the impact of Hurricane Katrina. There was a consultation in Detroit on the human rights experience of Arab and Muslim communities in the United States, focused a lot on that after 9/11. There was a consultation in Indian country, I think out in New Mexico on the specific issues looking there. There were consultations in Arizona and El Paso that with the Department of Homeland Security and the Border Patrol and other people that really focused on issues of immigration. But we traveled to Geneva to do these presentations. There was a simultaneous town hall in Geneva where civil society, who I think also in unprecedented numbers had traveled to Geneva to be part of this process, again, was able to question the United States delegation. And that was transmitted back to the United States. And this was, again, seen as a way to model openness and accountability for other countries. So we all felt really good about that. And there were about 200 recommendations that came from all of the other countries. And those recommendations are also all available at the website I gave. And again, you think about the impact. There's big impacts, there's small impacts. I have to say, for me, one of the things that was most powerful about actually being in Geneva was that, again, for several years I had done this kind of a, look at the reports, see what the recommendation is, and you always see the recommendation of the United States should cease using the death penalty. And yes, we have the death penalty, and but I'm the Department of Justice, right? You write the response in, but to sit in that hall in Geneva and to have 100 countries have 2 minutes, to be able to give recommendations to your country and to hear every single one of them, say like 100 times, the countries that were more our friends would say you should consider, stop using the death penalty, the ones where that were like, it's outrageous that you continue to use the death penalty. But it was just over and over, and it really did sort of bring home to you what an outlier we are on something that I wouldn't say you take for granted, but that you've come to a certain level of acceptance. And so I thought for me that was a very personal sort of, way of thinking about sort of the frame in which I thought about that and what a norm is. It was, I think for a lot of us, it was, especially being from justice, it was a very powerful moment and experience. And so the United States, again, this is a 4-year process. And so the next review of the United States will be in 2014. And in the immediate aftermath of accepting the recommendations, the State Department also wanted to think about what should it mean to implement the Universal Periodic Review. And what they decided to do was they developed 10 issue groups. They took all of the recommendations and sort of grouped them into categories: civil rights and discrimination, criminal justice, environmental and environmental justice, national security. And again, there's a list and there's a link here that shows the announcement of these issue groups. There are actual coordinators appointed from different agencies for each of these groups. Most of us have held meetings with groups, both internally with the other agencies who were involved or implicated by the recommendations in their agencies. And we're sort of trying to figure out, again, what does it mean to implement these recommendations? If you accept and implement a recommendation that says you will consider something, what should we be doing you know, who should be involved in considering that? How should we interact with civil society? What should we be discussing and then reporting back? And how do we know if we've really successfully implemented that? And there's no real answers to that right now. It's something that we're all thinking about, but I think it's a real opportunity, and we've had the benefit of a lot of input from people like Maria and other groups to help us, you know, think about what that should mean and what we should be doing. There was a issue group on recommendations related to economic, social, and cultural rights. And that group has not met yet, I think, with civil society, but that's, you know, one of the things we'll be looking at as well. So I think for people here and people working on this issue, both the civil rights, that issue group, and one called domestic implementation, again, it talks about what kind of a structure should the United States have to monitor and implement human rights going forward. Those are some groups that you might be interested in. I'll try and wrap up because I know we want to have a lot of time for discussion. So I'll just mention that there's another mechanism, as we've called it, this equality working group, which came a little bit before the UPR implementation groups, and we're trying to figure out the best way to overlap those. But it struck us that a lot of the treaties were really looking at some of the same issues, and we had a lot of the same agencies involved. And so we organized this group with 9 other agencies, Department of Defense, EPA, Energy, Education, Interior, EEOC, the Department of Homeland Security, and Justice, and State, to again sort of take advantage of the network that we had built up through the Universal Periodic Review to keep people engaged both at the political and at the staff level so that we could have some more continuity in the work that we were doing. And again, to try and focus on, you know, how could we integrate the recommendations and our obligations in human rights into the work that we were all doing at a program and policy level. And part of that, I think, is just making a broader range of people in the federal government, at least from my perspective, aware of what these obligations are and what they mean and what the United States has said we will do and we should do. And so when those are the people who, again, in this context are thinking about what kinds of programs should we be allocating our limited resources to in the context of homelessness, which regulation should we be prioritizing and trying to get through the Office of Management and Budget, what should those regulate, how should they affect, you know, how important is it, you know, how they will impact a certain community. We've spent a lot of time thinking about disparate impact. Again, this is a room of lawyers. There's a lot of discussion in the context of human rights about whether the human rights to non-discrimination include, again, not just intentional discrimination, but things that have a discriminatory effect regardless of the intent behind them, and whether and how our different constitutional and statutory rights really cover things that are not intentional discrimination. And so that's an area that we in the Equality Working Group have thought that we should sort of give some real thought to, both understanding what kind of protections we do and don't have and where some of those gaps are. So again, the Equality Working Group, we have meetings with civil society. We have an email list. If people would like to, you know, learn more about it and participate in some of those, it's something that's open. We are just at the beginning of starting to plan what our Universal Periodic Review consultation process should look like for 2014. The State Department is taking the lead on that, but we have invited civil society and others to tell us their thoughts about what that process should look like and what they'd like to see. We've certainly said we'd like it to be more interactive, that there should be more of a presentation and sort of accountability from the government in this round and not just us listening, but we haven't really sorted out what that would mean. But these are all things that I think, you know, this group of the ABA and other advocates, you know, we would welcome their input.
Great, thanks. I think that visual of the 100 different countries giving feedback on one issue, really pounding that in, is such a kind of powerful visual. And I want to get back to that, to talk about is there a way to create that kind of visceral reaction on housing as well. So turning to Heidi, where we can get a little bit more of a local perspective, the kind of national law center perspective and the federal government perspective, and Heidi brings us down to the local level, both from a kind of advocacy perspective and being involved in the legislative branch of the county. So creating the laws and creating the right to housing ordinances that she's worked on. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about your work and those kind of dual perspectives.
Sure, thanks Casey, and I just really want to thank the Commission for the invitation to be here and talk to you all. I'm really humbled to be sitting at this table with these expert attorneys. So thanks for this opportunity and your interest in this. First, I just want to talk a little bit about my perspective as a legal services attorney working in the state of Wisconsin, and some of the limitations that has in terms of what, our reach and how we can impact folks who are housing insecure. And in turn, I think you'll see why our local work on the right to housing resolutions has been so vital in changing that conversation. So I'm the only full-time legal services attorney for 9 counties in Wisconsin. So that's a lot of poor people to try to help. And so basically, we have to prioritize and turn a lot of people away. Really prioritize subsidized housing cases. It's very difficult to get into subsidized housing for folks. Even to get on a wait list, oftentimes those are closed, or the wait list is 3 years long, then you wait there and then you get denied because of some problem with your credit or criminal background. So we do prioritize those cases, try to keep folks in subsidized housing when they do have it. I do some work in eviction defense and in private landlord-tenant relationships as well. And I really, I like that work very much. But there are limitations. We, under our state and local law, really don't have adequate security of tenure. So even if you get the eviction dismissed, keep that person in their home, when their lease is up, there's not a lot you can do, and that could be a month from now, or a month from when you get the eviction dismissed. So you see the limits to, and it's important to get them as much time as you can so they can plan for the next steps and hopefully prevent homelessness. But, it doesn't mean that you're keeping them in housing forever. So that's a limitation. Also, just so many of our clients have an extremely high housing burden. They're poor by definition. And so, most of them can't access subsidized housing. So we know that if they're paying more than 30%, some close to 90%, their housing is not sustainable. It's just, they're barely getting by. They're one crisis away, like most of us are, from being on the streets. So similarly, in that same vein, we've had some state legislative changes that have impacted local government's ability to expand access to housing. So it's been frustrating. We've done some good work locally to protect folks with arrest and conviction records and regulate minimum income requirements in the city of Madison and security deposit amounts. And within the last year and a half, our ability to enforce those ordinances has been taken away by the state legislature. We've had, in the city of Madison, we have a very low vacancy rate. It's 2% for rental units. So even folks with the Section 8 voucher, and we have protections, fair housing protections for Section 8 recipients in Dane County and the city of Madison, but even folks with a voucher, which a few years ago would have pretty much guaranteed them a willing landlord. Now, because the landlords can be so picky, because they get 30 applications for every open unit, they just they're not able to get in. And so you see the unfortunate situation where folks are, just, falling off the rules of the program, even though they have this amazing potential benefit, but without a landlord taking them, they can't access housing. Obviously, there's gaps in the safety net that impact the work a legal services attorney can do. If your client doesn't have access to good health care, mental health services, case management, AODA, which is happening in all over with austerity measures at the state and federal level, it can be very difficult to provide them the support they need to keep their housing. So sort of in this desperation and in this situation of all these sort of perfect storm of circumstances that a group of folks got together to work on establishing a human right to housing in Dane County in the city of Madison. And I think it really has changed the conversation in our community and developed a platform for advocacy, and especially around policymaking and planning efforts. My outline was back there, and I'm not going to go through all of this because I do want us to be able to have a good discussion here. But you can look through it to see, you know, some of the initiatives that have been underway since the housing resolutions were passed. I think one of the most important aspects to the resolution, and this started with the organizing and the meetings, and from the very first meeting when this was discussed, was that the folks most impacted by the current housing crisis were the ones leading the way in, you know, in framing this debate, in pushing these resolutions. Folks from Operation Welcome Home, which is a group that is homeless, fighting for homeless. Folks who just get together, meet on a weekly basis. They kind of started with a crackdown in a city park. There was sort of some scapegoating going on with a crime that happened near a park, and there was a lockdown. There was blaming, unnecessary, awful blaming of homeless people that had nothing to do with it. And this group formed, and in association with Take Back the Land Madison, a group affiliated with the national movement that was trying to move homeless people into people-less homes. They said, we've been dealing with direct action, but we want a policy component to our work. What should we do, you know? And it's like, well, you know, you have talked about in your direct action, and you carry around this big, long, amazing banner that says housing is a human right. Why not, you know, why not work on a resolution and get the city and the county to pass a resolution just recognizing that, and then let's think about what that means and what that should mean for the city and the county. And so, you know, that over the several months, different community groups were engaged, and the city of Madison passed a resolution in November of 2011 recognizing the right to housing, and the Dane County Board passed a resolution this past July. Unfortunately, the attachment of the county resolution is missing page 2, but I will put the correct version or email it so it can get online for folks to see. But I think it's been interesting to see how the two different kind of companion resolutions have played out. Because the city resolution, they passed it, the advocates didn't even know that when it was coming up for a meeting, we'd worked hard on this thing, and then it just passed without us even really know, you know, kind of thing. And so that was sort of bizarre, and it called for a housing plan. But the county resolution has more concrete objectives in it, and that's what you're missing, unfortunately. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's in the county resolution. The county resolution also talks about developing a housing plan by this coming, we'll actually start the process by September 2012, and we have then initiated that process. But it means there's 7 kind of components of what they want to see in a plan, and then there will also be an annual report that tracks how we're doing on affordable and accessible housing needs by community. But some of the concrete benchmarks in the county one include provide an approach for reducing the number of homeless kids in schools in Dane County by 50% by September 1st, 2015, including the number of single-room occupancy units by 100 units and the number of housing units affordable to families supporting themselves on SSI or W-2 by 100 units by that same deadline, ensuring that no one seeking shelter will be denied access to shelter by that time, and providing additional daytime shelter space in the downtown area. Also noteworthy in that list is recommending policies to prevent foreclosures, evictions, utility shutoffs, criminalization of homelessness, and to help stabilize people in their housing. So what we have at the county level, we have dedicated advocates on the county board pushing this plan. We have the infrastructure with county committees that are working on it, and we have concrete goals. So the plan is not just another plan that's going to sit on a shelf, but it's got a clear time frame for targeting these specific actions and particular objectives, prioritizing, children and making sure no one's, denied access to shelter. Really, basic minimal stuff, but it's a starting point. Unfortunately, on the city side of things, we lack those that initiative, that leader, that champion on the city council. The housing committee has not met, and I think right now they're approving appointments, but has been on hiatus for several months. So on that, conversely, there you see just a kind of a lack of any kind of thing happening. So what's interesting playing out, city council is up for election right now, is that you have a lot of newer candidates, younger candidates, challengers who are really making housing and homelessness a big piece of their campaigns. Because with this, as you see with some of the initiatives, and unfortunately some of the challenges and backward steps that have been exposed and that we've seen during this struggle, there's been a lot of press attention to this issue. You want to talk about homelessness, the TV shows up. The papers called, the student newspapers have been covering it, not always as accurately as they should, but there's just been an outpouring of community and media response, which really has been critical. I mean, I think what happened is in Dane County, Madison, it's been, 15 years, they kind of like just didn't really do much in a long time. I mean, there was inclusionary zoning that the city of Madison passed in almost 10 years ago, but that the rental component of that was overturned in the courts. So that was really unfortunate. And then since then, there was supposed to be sort of, okay, now what? We need another strategy, and that never really happened. So I guess I'm hopeful that this new momentum is getting somewhere. And I think what it has done that's most noteworthy are two things. One, people without homes and people who are accessing homeless services or not, because they're not comfortable and don't like those services, are really becoming more visible. Have a more empowered voice, have more support and credibility in the community. We created a homeless issues committee at the county level that also has some city council people. So there is a place for them to go to have their voice heard, to bring their issues. And people are listening, and reporters are paying attention. And I think even though we've had these problems for a long time, and in some ways some things have gotten better, when you're working on this, you realize that the more work you do and the more visible the problems are, the more work you have ahead of you, right? So it's great to see folks coming out and speaking out on these important issues, but it also reminds us of the considerable work yet ahead. And I think the other thing that it's, when you're talking about defining it as a human right, and it's a lot more difficult for one level of government to abdicate responsibility and to say, well, the city doesn't deal with that. That's the county's responsibility. Or, well, it's not a mandated service under the state, so the county doesn't have to provide homeless services. And I think when you think about it being a human right, that becomes much more difficult, because it should be, what can we do? How can we be, proactive to the best, extent of our available resources, advance the right to housing and implement it here, instead of well, that's not really our job, you know, the feds don't give us enough money, that kind of thing. So anyways, it's been a really interesting experience, and I think has certainly not the only reason a lot of good work has happened recently. But it's been a good platform with which to engage folks and continue to support the other advocacy that has really sprouted up in the last year.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to open it up to questions just in a minute, but I want to start off with a couple of questions for our panelists who I think have given a fantastic perspective of what the kind of right to housing looks like at a national advocacy level from the federal government and in terms of county and local advocacy and lawmaking. But I think taking a step back, let's talk a little bit about the breadth of what a right to housing really means, because I think that can be a difficult thing to get your arms around. And there's circulating among the ABA right now a policy resolution on the right to housing. But to get there, we have to all kind of understand, at least to some extent, what we mean by a right to housing. And Maria, you led off with general comment 4, what is in a human right to housing. So let me just ask this to all three of you. From your perspective, is the human right to housing only met when all 7 of those things are met? Is that when we've actually accomplished the human right to housing, or is it going to the kind of local perspective? In the Dane County resolution, you talk about, not you, but the county now talks about the things that need to be done to start addressing the human right to housing, housing first options, SROs, eliminating waiting lists for substance abuse treatment, better health care for the uninsured, job training, affordable child care, a wet shelter, an end to using jails as mental health facilities. And then in the circulating resolution, there's section 7 talks a little bit about what the human right to housing is. So I guess what to you equates with meeting the human right to housing? If you could all chime in, and I guess, and Karen, your perspective from a federal level, at least with an analogy to other treaties, what it means to consider or actually meet that. So Maria or Heidi, if you want to start off.
I mean, I guess I'll start. So I think what it actually means, I think the way to think about these 7 elements is that this is a framework. And within that framework, there can be a lot more specificity. So some of the initiatives that Heidi mentioned, for example, can fit into that. Some other initiatives that we work on that we don't necessarily think of in these terms can fit into this. For example, what is legal security of tenure? It means you can't just be kicked out arbitrarily or with no notice. And we have some provisions. Now we actually have federal law that protects certain categories of tenants in foreclosed properties from being summarily evicted. They need to have at least 90 days notice. They have a lease that needs to be honored. Well, that's advancing security of tenure. So I think this can be done in pieces, and in some sense, one of the values of this general comment and the 7 elements is an agenda setting value. So it makes us think about, well, what does it really mean to have the human right to housing? It means housing has to also be affordable. We know we have a huge affordability crisis in this country. Well, why is that? I mean, we know that federal government used to commit much larger resources to subsidize housing, to public housing, than it does now. Well, that tells us that action needs to be taken, and it could be through federal funding, it could be through other state and local efforts. It means that something needs to be done to address the affordability problem. So I don't know if that answers the question, but maybe it does a little bit.
Heidi?
Sure. Yeah, I guess from my personal perspective, I think, in Madison and Dane County, it means things shouldn't get worse. They should get better. I mean, most simply, you know, we should not be destroying, demolishing units that are relatively affordable, that if you have a low income and you're a renter, that you're in for more high-end condos or other units. So, I mean, I think those are some things that it definitely needs to meet. And if that's happening, we say, no, look, you know, you can't do that anymore. But it also means that it's, you know, in that same vein, I think it means more than just words on paper. It means that you can actually point to something at that level of government and say, well, this is what, maybe it doesn't mean you're doing everything all at once, but it means you can point to some concrete things that you are actually making progress on and improving the situation. It's like, that's really general, but.
Karen, anything you want to add from that?
I think this is one of the things that, you know, we have some of the more difficult conversations, I think, with advocates about at the federal level and thinking about, you know, what are the treaties that, as Maria pointed out, that we've signed and ratified versus, you know, those that are not. Because the United States has not signed the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, we don't do reporting and have the same kind of that cycle and sort of implementation of those specific treaty obligations. I guess thinking, you know, as the sort of strategies you talked about, like, you know, specifics and pieces, I think, again, where there are pieces of that that deal with discrimination and they can be, that advance the goals of a human right to housing, you know, in the context of the, you know, Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination or the Convention on Civil and Political Rights. If things, again, if they can be framed in ways that they are connected to things that we have obligated, that's more likely to, you know, entertain a conversation on that level. The other thing that the United States will often say, again, is that when the United States ratifies a treaty and it goes to the Senate, there's sort of a long explanation that goes to the Senate and is part of the ratification. And the United States will make what's called reservations and understandings and declarations. And two of the things that are constant is that, again, in the United States says that when we ratify these treaties, we are, this is with the understanding that our current legal structure, at least as a structure, is sufficient to satisfy the obligations in these treaties. Now, just like with our civil rights laws, just because you have a civil rights law doesn't mean that everyone is enjoying your civil rights and you need enforcement and advocacy and assistance to make that a reality. And so I think even with that understanding, there's a clear recognition that there may be gaps in particular places and particular areas we should be working on. But there's a resistance, again, to framing the conversation at the federal level in terms of rights that are, you know, treaty rights that are not being satisfied at that structural level. And so I guess I would just encourage you to, I mean, I think that's a useful dialogue to have, and it's something that we need to understand. But in terms of, if you're really looking at things that are concrete and can get done, I think that's a more productive conversation at the federal level, if there are pieces that can be framed that way.
Karen, you mentioned needing enforcement to make it a reality, and in some of the materials, and certainly Heidi alluded to more than alluded to this, and legal services is mentioned. So this is maybe an obvious question, but what's the relationship between a human right to housing and civil gating? Is it a absolutely critical component of the human right to housing? And so does that mean that whenever we put a provision in this right to housing, there must be a provision for access to legal counsel to enforce that right, or can we get around that?
Well, I think enforcement is a really important issue. And I can't tell you in every situation what is the best way to word a resolution, but I think, you know, Legal Action has attempted to get a right to civil counsel in Wisconsin through the courts, through litigation, also through, not successfully, although we were able to, in one case, a termination of parental rights. There is now a civil right to counsel thanks to one of our cases, but not in housing. We also have tried through rulemaking, Supreme Court administrative rule petition. And that was also unsuccessful, but this came up last year. And, you know, one of the things that came down in the opinion on it was that the court recognized the inherent authority of judges to appoint publicly funded civil counsel in certain cases. So, which was consistent with our belief that they always had that inherent judicial authority to do that. And so Legal Action, there's a link, should be a link to it in your materials, developed a pro se motion packet for folks to, you know, request appointment of counsel. And even in our administrative rule petition, we weren't asking for appointment in every single case. Where, you know, you look at the factors because of the complexity of the case, because of the maybe counsel on the other side, because there's some very basic thing at stake. A home would certainly qualify for that. But I think, you know, at this point where we're at is like trying to push in those cases, you know, and seeing if we can assist some folks in getting publicly appointed counsel because of the nature of the case. It's complex. They actually have defenses. They, you know, it would really make a difference. And I think that's one way, you know, to go about it here. I think, you know, we continue to participate in that movement for more access to justice and increased legal services funding and all that stuff. But I guess that's how it's sort of playing out and what we're looking at in Wisconsin.
I'm going to open it up to questions and continue firing questions up until there's a hand, and it didn't take long.
Karen, have you all, since the administration has sort of changed the way it approaches these issues, have you all done any sort of quantifiable assessment of how that's trickling down to states and localities?
No, we haven't done anything systematic or quantifiable, but that is another area that we in the Equality Working Group and with a lot of assistance and urging of civil society are trying to think about. Because we're a federal system of government, another complication in these, the whole treaty reporting and implementation is that our obligations apply to us as a nation, not just to the federal government distinct from the states, but under our system, of course, the federal government cannot mandate that states take, you know, certain actions. And a lot of the housing, the other kinds of programs that we're talking about are things that are not necessarily inherent beyond the funding. And so we've been encouraged sort of at an education level, you know, asked what we can do to make more state and local government actors aware of what our treaty obligations are. We're, again, thinking about these consultations coming up with a particular eye toward what should we be trying to accomplish on that ground in these consultations. Should we be including state and locals in different issues? Should we have a specific consultation really geared around that? And so I think, again, we're thinking about it that way. There have been some small incremental steps, again, contacting state attorneys generals and governors and inviting them to be a part of this process. We're thinking about doing outreach to groups like the, you know, the Governors Association and, you know, the Council of Mayors. But again, we have these general ideas, but again, trying to think about what would be most meaningful and what's the best way to engage is another area, I think, where we're on an implementation level, we're trying to think about a better way to go about that.
Yeah.
I know you're a moderator, Casey, but you're also a legal services attorney. And I wanted to ask you the same question that you were asking, which I thought was a great question, and that is, what is that human right to housing? You know, what like in your practice, how do you see, for example, the convention that we haven't yet or haven't ratified, the Universal Declaration? You know, the whole kind of the concept of the adequate, I guess it's the adequate standard of living, which then leads to the adequate housing.
Well, I'll be brief because I have very little worthwhile to say on this subject compared to the panelists. But my practice has gone from working in a mix of adults cases and now to really homeless children, homeless students, and homeless youth. And actually, your question leads really well into what I was going to ask next about subpopulations. But I think this is a difficult thing, especially for unaccompanied youth. It's a very different thing to think about what a right to housing means for unaccompanied youth, especially those who are minors, who don't have the legal protections of an adult. And for homeless children who are with their families, There are certainly some strategic differences and differences in terms of how society looks at them versus somebody who's in an encampment. For homeless youth, you know, I think on one level, in my mind, it's somewhat more basic. On another level, it's more complicated. For homeless youth who are under 18, there should be a place where they can go, where they can be safe and have the protection of the authorities if they're escaping from an abusive situation. There has to be a safe. But I think some of the, as they get older, you get some more of the gradations of the complications that you need to have housing first models and models that serve the complexities of homeless youth, whether they be LGBTQ or undocumented or whatever the complications are. So I think to some extent, I don't have a full answer to what the right to housing means beyond that for the youth that I work with. For the homeless children, it's no different than the right to housing for homeless families, which to me means that I would go as far as to say it means having, at least moving towards that broad array of housing options and the mechanisms by which to enforce it. But there are other things. I mean, the general comment forward talks about, you know, other things like cultural adequacy. And I think we seem to lose sight of that when we just talk about housing. But when we talk about the whole thing, we can sometimes lose sight of the housing part of it. So let me twist that into the question that I was going to ask next, which is, and we've had this internal discussion, but are there risks to focusing on subpopulations in the human right to housing? Or should we be doing what has been done in some other areas, although not successfully when I think about the Convention on the Rights of the Child? Should we focus first on the children, because it's an easier population to pick off? And I noticed that in Congresswoman Waters' resolution, it focuses on children, and there's probably a good reason for that. Or should we focus on veterans, or do we need to do this about all homeless populations? Because if we don't, it's going to be too hard to get single adults in this. So let me throw that out to all of you as a question.
Well, I just want to clarify one thing on the last question. I do want to say that it is, private right of action is really important in any piece of legislation or resolution. I would be remiss if I didn't specifically say that, as well as access to counsel to enforce that right. But picking subpopulations, I think, is not ideal. I think, practically speaking, it happens. And when you're trying, you look at these list of strategies. I mean, we just passed in Dane County a resolution, joining the federal government's efforts to end the homelessness among veterans. And I was having an interesting conversation with one of the housing authority workers last week. She said, in the VASH program, and I'm assuming this to be true, but I haven't confirmed it, which is Section 8 vouchers for vets. They don't really have a criminal background piece to it. They're not screened out like other folks trying to access federally assisted housing based on certain criminal record issues. And to me, that was really something. It surprised me because since the mid-90s or whatever, it's been so strict in some ways and gives the housing authority so much discretion. But think about, that innocent child in a family with the mom who maybe had a run-in with the law or something like that. I mean, think about that kid. There's two very different standards based on, and so I think you have these weird situations when you choose to do that. Now, I think having a more, open and rehabilitative look to some issues related to criminal background or whatever is the appropriate direction to be going, but when you start picking and choosing who's special, I think that can be problematic and, minimize solidarity and the breadth of the movement.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of those points. I think it can be problematic. The resolution that you mentioned, Casey, referred to kids. That was partly a calculation on Congresswoman Waters' part that would make it more palatable. We have reservations about that, and in fact, in the next iteration of this resolution, we're going to broaden it. Because, part of the idea of human rights is that they're supposed to be universal, and they're supposed to apply to everyone. And not only that, but I should also point out that human rights are supposed to be interdependent. So we've been talking about the right to housing, But really, there are all kinds of other rights. And, you know, when you bring up homeless youth, well, it's not just housing. I mean, there are lots of other issues that could be relevant there, like, you know, health or access to any number of other kinds of things. So, as is the case with everything. So it's a little bit artificial to just be talking about one right in particular. So I think that, yeah, I think that it is ideal to be thinking universally and to be thinking about all the different rights and how they relate to each other. But, you know, that's ideal. In practice, you've got to deal with a reality. And so we might strategically decide we're going to go step by step, we're going to go incrementally, and that makes a lot of sense too. But just know that it's a strategy. It's not the end result.
Renato had a question, and then that sounds like that's it for questions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions I had was related to how can you do a better framework, can we do a better framework, I mean, as practitioners, to get the local government buy-in as well as people living in those communities. Because there's some communities, like for example, where I live in Orange County, California, there's just this really tug of, you know, if you're doing something like this, they look at it as, you know, again, the bigger government, it's this handout, and not really realizing, you know, what it does. And I just want to just dovetail a bit about, you know, and I thought about this issue of, you know, do you maybe pick, you know, maybe a certain group to start out with, to show, hey, you know what, this does really work like with vets. But then you raised the thought, I think, a really great issue about, well, no, because perhaps you start doing that and you're waiving it and it's not a universal right. Mm-hmm. But I guess maybe just going back to how can we go back and frame it in a way that people say, you know what, this makes sense.
Well, if that's a question for me, that's a very good question. That's a practical question. In our experience, sorry about that. In our experience, when we're talking to people who are directly affected about their own human rights, they get it. And it can be a really empowering and very intuitive concept. That's why I think human rights strategies are very good organizing strategies. Often they help people feel like, yeah, they matter, they're human, they have rights, and they can take some action. But I think we have to also be strategic. You know, Orange County may not be the best place. I mean, you've got to tailor your strategy to you know, what you're facing, and maybe then you need to have a different kind of framing. You talk about human rights. Well, make sure you also talk about responsibilities, because rights and responsibilities go together. It's not just about rights. And, you know, we also have lots of other arguments we could point to, like cost arguments. It can be much more cost effective to make sure people have a place to live than to have people living out on the street. And these can supplement this sort of human right framing and make it more palatable or more understandable to people. So that's
I'll just say briefly, I, again, don't have a lot of substantive expertise in housing and homelessness or compared to these sort of implementing this on the ground. But I would say at the federal level, what Maria just said about cost implications and talking to people, we've had a very energetic effort at the federal level around reentry that's been led by Attorney General Holder and has gotten buy-in, you know, at a cabinet level. Convening people every 6 months and looking very, both at a broad high level and in these very point-on ways about what can we do with the executive authority that we have that will advance, you know, again, that will lessen the burdens and the restrictions on people who were formerly incarcerated without jeopardizing public safety. And there's a strong network, I think, at the federal level, and a lot of places, again, that wouldn't have jumped to my mind. The state of Ohio is really engaged in this. The state of Pennsylvania, I think they see it both, some people as a cost, you know, imposition and a safety issue at the local level. Again, if you have people who are returning to these communities and they don't have services and they don't have jobs, what does that mean for crime? What does that mean for social services? There are people that can demonstrate that investing in certain kinds of ways. And there are a lot of, nonprofits who are also very invested in these kinds of activities and can be very vocal in their communities. And so I think looking for opportunities, around reentry, around serving veterans, is again something where we see a lot of, willingness to have a dialogue and to look at what works and doesn't bring on some of the, which we also see a lot, the concern about, what does this mean? Why is the UN, telling us what we should do? It's a different kind of conversation.
And from an organizing perspective, I think the more different types of groups and constituencies you can engage, and to broaden the appeal and to hear a multitude of different voices coming from different groups discussing this and getting behind this, the more effective you'll be. There was a lot of faith groups, labor, neighborhoods, different people coming in line to support the local resolutions we passed. Similarly, creating the social space for persons to have interpersonal connections, conversations with people from different economic status, helps to break down those barriers. And, to make it less academic, less about, the policy, but more about the right, the dignity of that person. And they probably have someone in their family who is in need, and they don't connect with it as much anymore or something like that. I think that really helps from sort of the organizing.
Paul, I had a question.
Well, I was heartened to hear the interrelation between responsibility and rights, because as a father of an 18-year-old son who would pose the question, I have a right to housing, does that mean I have a right not to have to pay for it? Does that mean I have a right not to have to work? I can see him jumping all over this. I think at Public Council, I work in Los Angeles, we've tried to develop a multifaceted approach that looks at, how do you create the means and opportunity for people to have access to housing? Mm-hmm. And that means not just, dealing with the base of affordable housing, but also preservation. Mm-hmm. And we have transactional attorneys that focus on both those aspects, but also eliminating barriers to entering the workforce so that people have the means of paying for their housing. And I think the more that you focus on, in terms of the cost analysis and the criticism, the more you show that we're trying to promote responsibility as well as the right. I think, the long-term struggle is going to be more in hand. The other facet is for people with disabilities, there's a huge unmet opportunity with respect to benefits that are available that they're not accessing because they don't have advocacy supports. In LA County alone, the Economic Roundtable came out with a study indicating 110,000 of our citizens should be getting SSI, who are getting a lesser form of assistance from the local government. And that has huge fiscal ramifications for our local economy. But that's a whole area where advocacy can step into the breach and really make a difference, creating economic empowerment, but also attacking, the cause of homelessness. Mm-hmm. But one question I had was, is there a place where the right to housing has resulted in ending homelessness in that community?
It's good. I was worried your one question was going to be, is anybody willing to take on my 18-year-old son? So.
I know the answer to that question.
Well, I wanted to take on your 18-year-old son.
Good.
But on any place, I talked earlier about Scotland and I think that's what I would point to as a place that's really doing a good job in actually implementing the right to housing. Now, France has also just recently adopted a right to housing. I think it's a part of their constitution. So, that's in earlier stages. Scotland is further along. So I think we do have some models of actual implementation, and that is great because it's pretty specific. Now, as far as your son is concerned, I think this idea about rights and responsibility is very important because, and also do these rights actually mean? They don't mean that you get to have a house for free or that your son can live with you for free or not work or anything like that. It's just that there's a right. Affordability is part of the standard. Well, that, and there's also, so that means that it needs to be affordable so you can pay for it. Not that it needs to be free unless you have zero income, but remember the interdependence of rights. There's also a right to work, which has a different meaning in human rights context than it does in sort of American context. It means that you are supposed to be able to get a job that pays a living wage and that can afford you the ability to pay for things like housing and meet your other basic needs. So these things go together.
I think the most unfortunate unintended consequence of this approach in Italy, there was a case we were visiting where on all the news stations, a father had been sued by his son for kicking him out of the house. And because he got a job for the son refused to accept it. And the court ruled in favor of the son. I said, well, how old was the son? Like 20? He goes, 45 years old. As a result, a lot of Italians are not having children because of the financial burden of taking care of them.
Oh boy.
Sounds
like we've hit a nerve here.
And I'm saying
that means you have 27 more years. If I do the math right.
And on the right to action side, one of the other unintended consequences that I could foresee us all having to struggle with. So you have a right to housing, you enforce it as a private right of action, court rules in your favor, and the community says, okay, we'll cite the housing here. The clients say, no, I don't want to live there. I see that all the time on an individual basis when we've got housing for people, and then they go there and they say, no, I don't want this option. So that's part of the complexity of the challenge we're up against.
Marilyn, do you have a question?
Yes. Just looking at gross economic spending level, I've heard a lot over the last year or two about how much tax expenditure was devoting to the mortgage interest subsidy. And are any of you aware of any statistical comparisons between that dollar amount and the amount that is invested by the federal and state governments in affordable and adequate housing?
Sort of. It's a lot more. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like 70 to 80 billion that in revenues foregone by the federal government because of those tax deductions versus under 40 billion for HUD's whole budget, and not all of which goes to low-income housing. And right now, there's a big push to fund the National Housing Trust Fund by capping the mortgage interest deduction.
Okay.
Yeah, so not doing away with it totally, but capping it above, I think, 250,000 would be the cap.
I've heard about that, and
Yeah.
I just hadn't heard what it's going to be devoted to, but that's...
Yeah. It would go to the National Housing Trust Fund, which would be devoted to producing more affordable housing for low and very low-income people.
Dial us back to one of the things we mentioned near the beginning about the ABA doing a resolution here, and each of you represents a different perspective and may look at the positions that the ABA takes differently. It's not a treaty. It's not a law, despite what we sometimes pretend. But what would that mean if the ABA were to adopt a right to housing for each of you in your practice, if it would mean anything?
I think it would mean a lot. I mean, I think it would mean that, we have the credibility of the ABA to point to, and we have the ability to work together with the ABA and go to meetings together and go to Congress together and go to local communities and say, look, the American Bar Association supports that. I think it would make a tremendous difference. A lot of what this work is about is education and sort of changing conversations and legitimizing human rights as a framework. So I think it would go a long way towards doing that.
Karen, how about from the, not that you're speaking on behalf of the whole federal government, but...
Or even not a piece of it. I think for us, when you have an organization like the ABA, especially for justice, we're an agency of lawyers and looking to law. I think, again, for us, it's a signal that we have partners, at a national level and at a local level. When I think about the specific kind of work that we're doing, when it's around sort of, reaching out to state and local officials and state and local governments, if it's, you know, something else we can point to in conversations with, you know, the National Association of District Attorneys and the National Association of Attorneys General, you know, I could see it being meaningful, and if you're engaging people, you know, from those groups as lawyers and members of the bar, and we're doing it. Our Access to Justice initiative, I think, does a lot of work with the ABA nationally and with initiatives around that locally. And so again, I think, you know, there are ways we could build on partnerships that are already out there to include other issues, and, you know, exactly where it's meaningful and what, you know, I think again it might be more on that outreach piece of it for us. I think we listen to Maria just as well as we listen to the American Bar Association at a national level, but I think you're reaching out to others, I would say in the civil rights division, certainly. But I think, again, I think on that level it can be meaningful.
Heidi?
I think for me, it would add additional legitimacy and support for petitioners, including legal services attorneys, to incorporate human rights into their advocacy strategies. And I think, you know, there is some skepticism that exists about, you know, well, will this, you know, judge in Rock County or whatever who's never met a tenant he liked, you know, you laugh at me kind of thing, you know. But I think the more groups, and certainly the ABA, you know, signing on to something like this, and just even, you know, that to use the human rights language, I think just bolsters that type of thinking and the creativity that really should be central to our work.
I'm going to ask one last question, and then I think we'll actually end and let. Yep, you need to go now.
No,
Okay,
go ahead.
Well, you will have time for this. I will.
Okay.
Well, I can't. I don't know. Maybe you'll miss your plane, but hopefully not. And then that's not funny. And then I think Heidi and Karen can hopefully stick around for questions, and people can mill about and talk with each other. But let me talk about homeless encampments. There's been a lot of news about homeless encampments. There's very few urban or urban communities where we don't hear about tent cities, unauthorized tent cities. And litigation certainly comes around that. The National Law Center has been involved, as well as firms doing pro bono work. So with the kind of expansion of tent cities and encampments of people who are homeless, there seems to be a corresponding push by cities and communities to get those people out of there. Not necessarily with corresponding housing offers of housing. And you know, this report from the Department of Justice and the interagency, that's such a, to me, seems like such a huge step to have the federal government weighing in on the criminalization of homelessness. But let's say we had a right to housing. Let's say each one of those communities passed a right to housing, whatever that means in your mind. Would that mean that you cannot evict people from public land, from squatting, from Paul's, his 18-year-old, from his house, unless you can offer them immediate shelter? And if that's the case, does that shelter have to be permanent? Does it have to be supportive? And how does that figure into litigation as it stands now? Maria?
Well, I think it would mean something like that. It wouldn't apply to Paul and his son. I think that's different. I do think that's different. But I think it would mean that if there is a tent city, and the reason the tent city is there isn't because people just felt like going on a camping trip, but there's no other alternative, there isn't enough affordable housing, there's not enough shelter space or usable shelter space, then I don't think you should be able, I think a right to housing would mean you can't evict people without ensuring that they have somewhere else to go. And it might also mean that you have to make it more, the right to water and sanitation might mean that you need to make sure there's a porta potty or some access to basic water supply there, as long as people are there because they have to be there. And it would also mean that there has to be a plan to make sure that there is enough, to develop enough affordable housing, because a tent doesn't meet the standard of adequate housing either. It's just an interim thing. And the real right to housing means making it the case that there's enough affordable housing for people who are really poor.
Actually, I'm going to end on that, and then folks can come and talk to Heidi and Karen about it, so that we can make sure that we give thanks to all of the three panels as Maria runs off to catch her flight. I know that Karen and Heidi had more to say on this, and I apologize for ending early, but it's always nice to end while it's still flowing.
I apologize.
So that's okay. So I just want to thank, this was a fantastic panel of three folks who really represent three very unique perspectives, and they all came from out of town to do this, and away from family and the like. So thank you very much, Maria and Karen and Heidi, for coming and talking to us, and we really appreciate it. So
Thank you.
let's give them a round.